Most of the men who fought the Second World War eventually came home. The victors came home to parades. The defeated came home to ruins. But they came home. They saw their towns again, their families, the fields they grew up in. Whatever the war had done to them, the ground that finally held them was their own. More than 1 million German soldiers never got that. They died as prisoners. In frozen camps in Siberia, in muddy fields along the Rhine, in coal mines in France and on minefields in Denmark. And when they died, their bodies were not sent home. They were buried where they fell, in the soil of the countries they had invaded or the countries that had captured them. And most of them are still there today. Not for years, for decades, for 80 years and counting. In June of 2023, in a war-torn corner of Ukraine, a dam was destroyed. The reservoir behind it drained away, and as the water fell, the mud gave up something it had been hiding since 1943, human remains, dozens of them. At first, people assumed they were victims of the war happening right now. They weren't. They were German soldiers, dead for 80 years, uncovered by chance while a new war raged overhead. And a German organization was quietly notified, because to this day, that organization still digs up thousands of German war dead every single year across foreign lands and reburies them right where they're found. Not in Germany, there. So here is the question this whole story turns on. Why were German POWs buried so far from home? And why, 80 years after the guns fell silent, are they still there? The answer isn't simple. It's a story of law, of logistics, of money, of shame, and of a Cold War that froze an entire generation of the dead in place. Let's start at the beginning, with a surrender so enormous it broke the system meant to handle it. When Nazi Germany collapsed in May of 1945, the scale of the defeat was almost impossible to grasp. Across the globe, more than 11 million German military personnel fell into enemy hands. 11 million. Whole armies laid down their weapons in the space of weeks. There were rules for this. The 1929 Geneva Convention laid out how prisoners of war were to be treated. They were to be fed properly, housed, and if they died, they were to be buried honorably, their graves marked and recorded, so they could be found again. But rules are written for normal times. And 1945 was not a normal time. Europe was in ruins, the roads were cratered, the railways were bombed to pieces, the farmland was wrecked, the harvest had failed, and there was barely enough food to keep the surviving civilians alive, let alone 11 million captured soldiers. The system designed to manage prisoners didn't bend under that weight. It broke. And so, in the months after the fighting stopped, something terrible happened that most people never learn about. Prisoners kept dying, not in combat, the war was over. They died in captivity, from hunger, from disease, from cold, from exhaustion. They died by the thousands every week, long after the last shot was fired. But how they died, and how many, depended entirely on who was holding them. And here the story splits in two. Because the fate of a German prisoner in the West was a world apart from his fate in the East. In the Soviet Union, captivity was close to a death sentence. The Soviets had lost more than anyone in this war. Tens of millions of their people were dead. Their cities were rubble. And when German prisoners fell into their hands, that grief and that rage translated into camps where survival was never the point. Food was tied to labor. Work harder, eat a little. Fail to meet your quota and your rations were cut, which made you weaker, which made the work harder, which cut your rations again. It was a spiral, and at the bottom of it was death. Think about what had already happened at Stalingrad. When the German 6th Army surrendered there in early 1943, around 91,000 men went into Soviet captivity. Within months, roughly 85,000 of them were dead. They were already starving when they surrendered, and the typhus swept through the holding pens and took almost all of them. Of those 91,000 men, only a few thousand ever saw Germany again, and even reaching a camp could kill you. The Soviets moved prisoners across their vast country in unheated railway boxcars in the dead of winter, In one documented case in May of 1943, a single transport train set out for a camp near Saratov, carrying just over 8,000 prisoners. Before the train even arrived, before a single name could be written in a camp register, more than 1,500 of them were dead. Frozen. Gone. Those who lived were put to work rebuilding the country they had helped destroy. The Soviets called it reparations through labor. Hundreds of thousands were sent into the mines and heavy industry of the Donets Basin, where in some sectors nearly a quarter of them died from the conditions. By the most careful modern estimates, more than 1 million German prisoners died in Soviet hands. And here is where a genuine mystery begins, one that historians still argue about today, because the official Soviet records admit to only around 381,000 deaths. But roughly 2 million German soldiers who went east were simply listed as missing. They never came home, and they were never recorded as dead. So where did they go? The answer, most historians now believe, is chilling in its simplicity. They died before the paperwork could catch them. They died on the forced marches. They froze in the boxcars. They were shot in the fields at the moment of surrender. They existed one day as living, captured men, and the next they were gone, before any clerk wrote their names in any book. A bureaucracy doesn't lose 700,000 men by accident. It loses them by choosing not to count them. Now, you might expect the story in the West to be gentler, and in many ways it was. But it carried its own dark chapters, and one of them is an irony so sharp it's still debated today. In the West, most German prisoners survived. On American and British soil, the camps largely followed the rules. Prisoners were fed, housed, put to work on farms, and the death rates were low. Many German soldiers held in places like Texas or the English countryside later said the years in captivity were the safest of their entire war. But in Europe itself, in the chaos of that first summer, it was different. As the Allies swept forward, they captured Germans faster than they could build anything to hold them. Along the Rhine, the Americans set up vast open-air enclosures, the Rhine meadow camps, where prisoners were penned in muddy fields behind barbed wire, exposed to the rain and the cold, with food that couldn't reach them fast enough. Men sickened. Some died of dysentery and exposure. And this brings us to the sharpest irony of the whole war's end. In the spring of 1945, faced with millions of surrendering Germans and a continent that could not feed them, American commanders made a fateful decision. They stopped calling these men prisoners of war. General Eisenhower reclassified surrendering German troops as disarmed enemy forces. The British used their own term, surrendered enemy personnel. It sounds like paperwork. It was anything but, because a prisoner of war was owed full rations under the Geneva Convention, the same food as Allied base troops. A disarmed enemy force was owed no such thing. With the stroke of a pen, the legal obligation to feed these men at full strength simply vanished. Now here's the part that matters, and it's the part that separates history from myth. In 1989, a writer claimed that Eisenhower had used this loophole deliberately, that he had knowingly starved as many as 1 million German prisoners to death in the Rhine camps out of pure revenge. It was a shocking accusation, and serious historians took it apart piece by piece using the actual archives. The truth was grimmer and more human than any conspiracy. The real death toll in the Rhine meadow camps was in the thousands, somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000, not 1 million. And it wasn't a plot to exterminate anyone. It was a nation facing an impossible choice. There was not enough food. If you fed the millions of surrendered German soldiers at full ration, you would take that food from the starving civilians the Allies had just liberated from the Nazis, the survivors of the camps, the occupied, the bombed. Eisenhower's men weren't choosing to kill Germans. They were choosing who would go hungry in a continent that had run out of food. That is the real weight of 1945, not villainy, an impossible arithmetic of survival. But the most disturbing chapter in the West wasn't the food, it was the sand. When the war ended, the coast of Denmark was buried under more than 1.5 million German landmines. Someone had to clear them. And the Allied answer, overseen by British and Danish command, was to send the Germans who had laid them out to dig them up, by hand. Many of these men were barely men at all. They were teenagers, boys pulled into the last desperate months of the war, now made to walk shoulder to shoulder across live minefields with little more than metal prods and their own fingers. They crawled forward across the dunes, feeling in the sand for the mines that could kill them in an instant. Around 150 of them were killed. Hundreds more were maimed, losing hands, arms, eyes, legs. Boys who had surrendered, expecting to go home, instead spent the summer of 1945 crawling toward death across the beaches of a country they had occupied. Whatever you think of the war they were dragged into, that is a hard thing to sit with. So that is how they died. In the mud, the snow, the mines, the boxcars, and the camps. Which brings us back to the real question. When these men died, why weren't their bodies sent home? Why bury them abroad at all? And the first part of the answer is the law itself. The Geneva Convention was very specific about the dead. It said that a captured soldier who died must be buried honorably, according to his religion where possible, and, crucially, that his grave must be marked and recorded so it could be found at any time in the future. The detaining power had to run a graves registration service. It had to write down who was buried and where. But notice what the law did not say. It did not say the body had to be sent home. Repatriation, returning the dead across borders, was simply not required. In the middle of a war, and in the shattered aftermath of one, moving millions of bodies across a broken continent was a physical impossibility. So the law asked for something achievable instead. Bury them with dignity, mark the grave, record the name, make them findable. And in the West, the Allies mostly did exactly that. When a German died in American or British hands, he was often buried much like their own soldiers. In an individual grave, marked with a cross, his identity tag recorded and kept. Those records were filed away carefully in national archives, where they still sit today. In the Soviet East, it was the opposite. The sheer number of dead, combined with a total indifference to the enemy, meant mass graves. Dozens of prisoners were dropped into unmarked trenches, often to stop disease from spreading. Wood was too scarce for coffins or crosses, and the clerks frequently recorded only numbers, a tally of the dead to balance the labor books, not names, which is exactly why, decades later, finding and identifying these men would become so agonizingly hard. So the bodies stayed where they died, and in the first years after the war, everyone assumed that was temporary. Surely, once things settled, Germany would bring its dead home. It never happened. And the reasons why are where this story turns from tragedy into something stranger. Start with the simplest reason: money and power. In 1945, Germany was destroyed. It was split into occupation zones. Its economy was gone, its cities flattened, its people starving. A defeated, bankrupt, divided nation had no funds to repatriate millions of bodies, no ships or trains to move them, and no diplomatic power to demand anything from anyone. The United States could afford to bring its own dead home across the oceans in a vast, expensive program. Germany could not. Germany could barely feed the living. But there was a second reason, and it was deliberate. The Allied occupation authorities actually banned the mass movement of German war dead. Why? Because they feared what those bodies could become. Bring home millions of fallen Wehrmacht soldiers, hold great national funerals, build grand tombs, and you risk creating shrines, rallying points, symbols that a wounded, defeated nation might gather around, that a new wave of nationalism might feed on. The Allies had just spent years destroying the Nazi regime. They were not about to hand its dead back as martyrs. So the bodies stayed abroad, and over time, that necessity hardened into a permanent policy. In 1954, the West German government gave the task of caring for these graves to an organization called the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, the German War Graves Commission. And rather than fight for the impossible dream of bringing everyone home, they accepted a hard truth. The dead would stay where they had fallen, but they would be cared for. Through the 1950s, West Germany signed agreements with its former enemies in the West. One of the clearest examples is the 1959 treaty with Britain. German war dead. Luftwaffe pilots shot down over England, U-boat crews, prisoners who died in British camps, had been scattered across hundreds of small churchyards all over the country. Under the treaty, they were gathered up and reburied together in one place, the Cannock Chase German Military Cemetery. Former enemies, now maintaining German graves side by side on British soil. It fulfilled the law, it honored the dead, and it neatly avoided the political friction of ever sending Wehrmacht bodies back to Germany. That model, consolidate, don't repatriate, became the template across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and it might have covered the whole continent except for one enormous problem. Half of Europe had just disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. And that's where most of the dead were. The vast majority of German war dead lay in the East, in the Soviet Union, in Poland, in the lands where the worst fighting and the deadliest camps had been. And after the war, a wall of ideology and barbed wire slammed down across the continent. The Volksbund could work in the West. It could not set foot in the East. For decades, the German dead behind the Iron Curtain were not just neglected. In many places, they were erased. Soviet and Eastern Bloc authorities paved over German cemeteries, built on top of them, let them vanish under forests and towns. In communist East Germany, the state saw the Wehrmacht dead as fascist aggressors, unworthy of mourning. Public grief was discouraged. The War Graves Commission was banned outright. And so, year after year, millions of graves in the East slipped out of memory. The men in them weren't just far from home. They were being deliberately forgotten. That was the freeze, and it lasted until the whole system came crashing down. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and for the first time in nearly half a century, the doors to the East swung open. What the War Graves Commission found there was staggering. More than 2 million German soldiers still lay scattered across Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond, in battlefield graves, in the trenches of old camps, under fields and forests, an entire lost army waiting in the ground. And so began one of the strangest and most quietly moving projects in modern Europe. Rather than attempt the impossible task of sending 2 million bodies home, Germany made the same choice it had made in the West. It would gather them together and honor them where they fell. Great new cemeteries were built near the old camps and battlefields, collection grounds for the recovered dead. To this day, the work goes on. Every year, exhumation teams recover and rebury tens of thousands of German war dead in the East. And in 2023, nearly 80 years after the war, they recovered their 1 millionth set of remains since the Cold War ended. 1 million. And they are still digging. If you want to see what that looks like, go to Sologubovka, near St. Petersburg, near the old siege lines of Leningrad. It is one of the largest German war cemeteries on Earth. More than 80,000 men are buried there, and the number keeps rising as more are found. There are no individual crosses. There couldn't be. Instead, vast lawns are lined with granite steles carved with thousands upon thousands of names, because the dead came in numbers too great for anything else. Or go to Le Cam in Normandy, where around 21,000 German soldiers lie beneath dark, low crosses of black basalt, grouped in fives, set into the ground. It was a deliberate choice. No triumph, no white marble glory, just dark stone and quiet earth, the architecture of mourning and of a defeat that Germany chose not to hide from. And this is the final turn of the story, the part that answers not just why they were buried far from home, but why anyone still bothers with them at all. Because caring for these graves today is not about honoring the regime these men fought for. It never was. It's about something much older and much simpler than politics. Consider a soldier named Eino Strobel. He went missing in the war, like millions of others. His family never knew where he lay. Decades passed. And then, using modern DNA analysis on remains recovered from the East, forensic scientists were finally able to give those bones a name. Eino Strobel had been found. 74 years after the war ended, his elderly brother, an old man now, was at last able to stand at a marked grave and know that this was his brother. 74 years of not knowing ended, A wound that had stayed open across an entire lifetime finally closed. That is what the digging is really for. Not the regime, not the flags, the families, the brothers, the sons, the grandchildren who spent their whole lives with an empty space where a name should be. And when the searchers find a man they cannot identify, no DNA match, no legible tag, nothing, they do not leave him nameless in the dirt. They bury him in a war cemetery under a marker that reads, in German, ein unbekannter deutscher Soldat. An unknown German soldier. Because even the ones whose names are lost forever are still owed a marked place in the earth. So why were German POWs buried so far from home? Because a war ended in ruin, and there was no money to bring them back. Because the victors feared what those bodies might become if they returned. Because a curtain of ice fell across Europe and locked millions of them away. And because, in the end, a nation decided that the most honest way to face its dead was to leave them where they fell, and to tend them there forever. They lie in Russian forests and French fields and English churchyards, far from the towns they were born in, far from the families who waited and never stopped wondering. But they are not forgotten. Every year, someone brushes the dirt from another rusted tag. Every year, another name comes home, even if the body never can. 80 years on, the earth is still giving them back, one soldier at a time, lest we forget.